In the uneasy calm that settled over Europe after the First World War, Britain struggled to interpret the chaos unfolding on the continent. Amid economic depression, political turmoil, and the disillusionment of a generation, an obscure German agitator began transforming his rhetoric into a movement. As parliamentary debates in London focused on domestic hardship, Winston Churchill watched developments in Germany with a wary eye. He recognized patterns that reminded him of the forces that had plunged Europe into catastrophe just decades earlier. Even as newspapers dismissed Hitler as a provincial demagogue, Churchill sensed a dangerous ambition radiating from the broken state he aimed to reshape, a threat compounded by the world's desire to forget the horrors of recent memory. Churchill's concern stemmed not from abstract speculation but from the raw lessons of history. He had witnessed firsthand how nations can sleepwalk into conflict when blinded by hope or distracted by internal strife. The Versailles Treaty's punitive terms, though celebrated by some, seemed to him a brittle framework destined to be exploited by any leader reckless enough to do so. Hitler's early speeches, laced with resentment and violent nationalism, struck Churchill as signals of a political climate shifting toward extremism. To him, Germany's humiliation was not the end of danger but the beginning of a new cycle, one that would be far more destructive if left unchallenged. While many British politicians believed the scars of the Great War would deter any future aggression, Churchill perceived the opposite. He observed that economic despair and wounded national pride could become catalysts for radical ideologies, especially under a leader eager to channel anger into expansion. Hitler's rapid ascent within Germany's fractured political system did not surprise him. What alarmed him was how quickly democratic institutions crumbled once he gained a foothold. Churchill warned that the world was witnessing the birth of a dictatorship forged through propaganda, intimidation, and a mastery of public discontent. As Hitler consolidated power, Churchill scrutinized every development, each new decree curtailing freedoms, each purge eliminating rivals, each rearmament initiative disguised as national recovery. Where others saw internal German affairs, he detected preparations for a geopolitical upheaval. He spoke in Parliament about the dangers of ignoring these signs, insisting that the fragile peace secured in 1918 was being eroded not by chance but by deliberate strategy. His warnings, however, often fell on ears desperate for stability, reluctant to face the possibility of another continental war. Churchill's isolation in these early warnings grew more pronounced as global powers embraced a comforting illusion that Hitler sought only to rectify injustices of the Versailles Treaty, not shatter the European order entirely. Diplomatic circles clung to the hope that negotiation, patience, and compromise would temper Germany's autocratic trajectory. Churchill understood this impulse but regarded it as perilous. His study of empires, armies, and history convinced him that tyrants rarely limit themselves to the concessions granted by naive rivals. It was during these years that Churchill refined his narrative about Hitler, not as a nationalist seeking reform but as a militarist intent on overturning the balance of power. He believed that ignoring such a figure amounted to strategic negligence. His speeches increasingly invoked the grim reality of German rearmament, the militarization of youth, and the suppression of dissent. These developments, to him, represented not isolated policies but interconnected steps toward a goal that would soon engulf Europe in flames. Though Churchill had no official role in government during much of this period, he amassed information from newspapers, diplomatic contacts, émigrés, and intelligence officers who trusted his judgment. He meticulously read German publications, noting shifts in tone and ideology. His capacity to connect disparate events, Hitler's consolidation of power, the subjugation of the press, the reorganization of the military, gave him a clarity that others lacked. Britain's reluctance to rearm or even acknowledge the danger left him deeply troubled, fueling his determination to speak out despite the political cost. By the mid-1930s, Churchill stood almost alone among senior British figures in sounding the alarm. He warned that Hitler was not simply restoring Germany but preparing it for conquest. The combination of ideology, resentment, and militarization formed what he believed was an existential threat to Europe's stability. His speeches, though sometimes dismissed as alarmist, captured a profound truth: peace is most fragile when built on denial. As the world clung to the remnants of hope, Churchill saw in Hitler the shadows of a future war already taking shape. News of Hitler's early domestic policies reached Britain through a mixture of official channels and frightened testimonies from those fleeing Germany. Churchill followed these reports obsessively, noting not just their immediate implications but their deeper ideological meanings. The abolition of political pluralism, the expansion of state surveillance, and the establishment of secret police forces were, to him, unmistakable signs of a regime preparing to dominate through fear. Yet many British observers viewed these developments as internal matters, distant from Britain's interests. The blindness to the interconnectedness of European security frustrated Churchill profoundly. The reintroduction of conscription in Germany jolted Churchill, confirming his belief that Hitler aimed to rebuild Germany into a military power capable of challenging its neighbors. Each new regiment paraded through Berlin served as a warning sign that Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond rhetoric. Churchill's speeches emphasized that rearmament under a dictator should never be dismissed as routine. He believed that morality and strategy were intertwined. A regime built on suppression would not hesitate to impose its will on others. As Churchill dissected Germany's rapid militarization, he recognized a pattern that echoed the build-up to previous conflicts. Industrial output redirected toward arms production, the revival of heavy industries in the Ruhr, and the construction of aircraft factories signaled preparations for sustained conflict. His warnings highlighted the imbalance between Germany's growing might and Britain's reluctance to modernize its own defenses. The illusion that diplomacy alone could restrain a militarized dictatorship troubled him deeply. The Night of the Long Knives in 1934 reinforced Churchill's belief that Hitler's rule rested on violence. The purging of the SA leadership was not merely an internal consolidation of power but a message to the world. Hitler intended to eliminate any obstacle to his ambitions, whether political, military, or ideological. Churchill analyzed this event as evidence of a regime unconstrained by legal or moral limits. Unlike many who saw it as an isolated episode, he interpreted it as a precursor to the aggressive foreign policies soon to follow. Churchill also studied Hitler's manipulation of the German populace. He recognized the propaganda machine as a strategic weapon, crafted to unify Germans under a distorted vision of national destiny. Nazi rallies, radio broadcasts, and school curricula were not signs of cultural revival but instruments shaping a society prepared for conquest. Churchill warned that a nation indoctrinated with militarism and obedience would become a formidable engine of aggression. He also noted how Hitler capitalized on the world's fatigue with conflict. Britain and France, seeking stability, were eager to interpret his actions as defensive rather than expansionist. Churchill argued that such interpretations ignored the relentless logic of dictatorships, which gain strength through external victories that validate internal authority. He believed that Hitler's early successes emboldened him and that appeasement only fueled his appetite for more. Churchill's analysis of Hitler's speeches deepened his understanding of the dictator's worldview. He dissected each phrase, searching for clues about future ambitions. References to living space, racial purity, and national revival were not metaphors but ideological commitments. Churchill warned that these commitments, once backed by military force, would become directives for territorial expansion. His ability to see in words the seeds of future actions separated him from contemporaries who clung to optimistic interpretations. Despite facing political marginalization, Churchill persisted in warning the nation. He believed Britain could not afford to ignore the signs of a rapidly escalating danger. Each step Hitler took strengthened his capacity to wage war, and each British hesitation weakened the chances of preventing it. Churchill became a lone sentinel, urging a reluctant nation to confront a threat growing in both power and confidence. His insistence that Hitler's rise was not an internal German issue but a European crisis placed him at odds with prevailing sentiment, yet his convictions remained unshaken. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936 marked a turning point that Churchill had feared yet fully expected. German troops marched into the demilitarized zone with a confidence born from the belief that neither France nor Britain would intervene. From the moment the first soldiers crossed the bridges at Cologne, Churchill saw more than a breach of treaty terms. He saw the testing of European resolve. Hitler acted with calculated audacity, knowing that the weary democracies were unwilling to risk confrontation. Churchill warned that if this gamble went unanswered, it would embolden further acts of aggression. He recognized the event as the moment when treaties ceased to restrain Berlin and appeasement became a dangerous tradition. While many British leaders minimized the significance of the Rhineland, Churchill scrutinized Germany's strategic motivations. To him, the move was not symbolic but foundational. A reclaimed territory meant access to defensive depth, industrial strength, and strategic freedom. Hitler understood that controlling the Rhineland gave Germany leverage over France and rendered future operations more secure. Churchill argued that allowing this action would encourage Hitler to treat Europe's agreements as obstacles to be bypassed rather than commitments to honor. His warnings, however, were overshadowed by political leaders who interpreted the occupation as a reaction to past humiliation rather than a step toward future conquest. The international response was marked by hesitation. France considered intervention but required British backing, which never materialized. Churchill watched with alarm as diplomatic caution replaced strategic clarity, reinforcing Hitler's belief that the Western powers lacked the will to act. In Parliament, Churchill declared that the failure to oppose the Rhineland incursion was a missed opportunity to restrain Hitler while he was still vulnerable. He emphasized that Germany's forces were not yet strong enough to resist a determined response. Yet no such response came. The moment passed, and with it, a crucial chance to prevent Hitler from altering the balance of power. Churchill's analysis went beyond military considerations. He saw the Rhineland crisis as proof of Hitler's mastery of political timing. The dictator chose a moment when Britain was preoccupied with domestic concerns and France was paralyzed by political instability. By acting decisively while others hesitated, Hitler demonstrated an understanding of psychological warfare, using boldness as a weapon to unsettle adversaries. Churchill warned that such tactics, if not confronted, would shape Germany's future operations. He believed that Hitler's real power lay not in his armies but in his ability to exploit uncertainty. As Germany fortified the Rhineland, Churchill assessed how the region's transformation altered the strategic map of Europe. New fortifications, airfields, and troop deployments strengthened Germany's western frontier. Churchill understood that this shift would allow Hitler to redirect military resources eastward, setting the stage for expansion into Central and Eastern Europe. The construction of the Siegfried Line symbolized not just defensive preparation but the infrastructure of a regime preparing for sustained conflict. Churchill's warnings drew attention to how German industry, now mobilized for war, was producing the machines and materials that would soon fuel aggression. With the Rhineland secured, Churchill noted an increase in Germany's diplomatic assertiveness. The regime's representatives spoke with newfound confidence at the League of Nations, their tone reflecting the belief that treaties could be reshaped through force. Hitler's speeches grew more ambitious, hinting at unification with Austria and influence over the Sudetenland. Churchill saw in these proclamations the outlines of a grand strategy, the reassembly of German-speaking territories under a single flag, creating a state powerful enough to dominate Europe. He warned that ignoring these ambitions risked repeating the mistakes of earlier eras when dictators were dismissed until it was too late. Churchill's critique of British policy grew sharper. He argued that the nation's reluctance to rearm left it vulnerable to a rapidly strengthening Germany. While budget-conscious politicians debated the cost of new aircraft and modern ships, Churchill insisted that the cost of unpreparedness would be far greater. He highlighted intelligence reports indicating rapid expansion in the German Air Force and Army, pointing out that Britain's defenses were dangerously outdated. His calls for modernization were met with skepticism from leaders who feared provoking Germany rather than deterring it. Yet Churchill remained undeterred. He continued to analyze Germany's trajectory with the conviction that only a strong, united response could prevent catastrophe. The Rhineland crisis reinforced his belief that Hitler interpreted diplomatic restraint as weakness. Churchill argued that moral appeals were meaningless against a leader guided by ambition, ideology, and a vision of continental domination. His warnings reflected a deep understanding of how history punishes complacency. As Europe shifted beneath the weight of German expansion, Churchill's voice became a persistent reminder that the continent was drifting toward a conflict few were willing to acknowledge but he saw with unmistakable clarity. The Anschluss of 1938, the annexation of Austria into the Third Reich, provided Churchill with further vindication but deepened his despair over Europe's inability to respond. He watched as German troops crossed into Vienna unopposed, greeted by orchestrated displays of enthusiasm. To Churchill, this was the culmination of Hitler's long-declared ambition to unite all German-speaking peoples under one empire. He warned that the Anschluss shattered the illusion that Hitler sought only limited redress for past grievances. Instead, it revealed a strategy aimed at remaking the map of Europe through pressure, intimidation, and, when needed, force. Churchill understood the geopolitical significance of Austria's absorption. The annexation not only increased Germany's population and resources but granted Hitler a strategic foothold in Central Europe. From this position, Germany could project influence toward Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the Balkans. Churchill analyzed how the Anschluss altered the balance of power, making it far more difficult for neighboring states to resist German demands. He warned that allowing such expansion without resistance would embolden Hitler to pursue further territorial ambitions, destabilizing the fragile peace that had held since 1918. The reaction of the Western democracies troubled Churchill deeply. Britain expressed concern but took no action. France, though alarmed, was politically fractured and unable to respond decisively. Churchill argued that this passivity was dangerous. He stressed that the international community's failure to uphold treaties enforced a deadly lesson, that Hitler could violate agreements without consequence. The lack of resistance validated the Nazi belief that boldness paid dividends, encouraging further aggression. Churchill's scrutiny extended beyond territorial changes to the human cost. He listened to reports of Austrian Jews being publicly humiliated, businesses confiscated, and political opponents arrested. While many in Britain remained indifferent to such accounts, Churchill saw them as evidence of ideological fanaticism merging with state power. He warned that a regime willing to brutalize its own subjects would not hesitate to impose its will on other nations. The widespread Nazi propaganda and suppression of dissent illustrated how totalitarianism transformed society into an engine of conformity and cruelty. Churchill also understood that the Anschluss provided Germany with increased industrial and military capabilities. Austrian factories were quickly repurposed for arms production, while gold reserves and assets replenished the Reich's finances. Strategic railways and mountain passes strengthened Germany's ability to maneuver forces across Central Europe. Churchill analyzed these shifts closely, arguing that the militarization of Austria created conditions for rapid mobilization that could threaten neighboring states within weeks or even days. As Germany celebrated its bloodless victory, Churchill emphasized that the ease of the Anschluss revealed something even more alarming: the psychological collapse of resistance in Europe. He believed that states intimidated by Hitler's propaganda and military strength were increasingly willing to concede territory in exchange for promises he had no intention of keeping. Churchill warned that such concessions were not preserving peace but merely postponing confrontation while strengthening the aggressor. Britain's political leadership continued to seek diplomatic solutions, framing the Anschluss as a unique situation rather than a step within a broader strategy. Churchill rejected this interpretation, arguing that Hitler operated according to a coherent plan shaped by ideology and historical resentment. The dictator's ambitions were not reactive but purposeful. Churchill insisted that recognizing this pattern was essential for responding effectively. Yet his warnings remained largely unheeded as British leaders clung to hopes that negotiation could satisfy Hitler's demands. Despite political isolation, Churchill persisted in articulating a vision of collective security grounded in strength rather than appeasement. He urged rearmament, strengthened alliances, and a firm stand against further German expansion. His speeches highlighted the cost of timidity and the danger of interpreting Hitler's actions through the lens of democratic values rather than totalitarian ambition. As Austria fell under Nazi control, Churchill's warnings gained a new urgency. He foresaw that unless Europe awakened to the scale of the threat, the next target would fall even more rapidly, and with far more dangerous consequences. The Sudetenland crisis of 1938 brought Churchill's warnings into sharper focus. Czechoslovakia, a democratic state with a strong military, found itself targeted by Hitler under the pretext of protecting ethnic Germans living in the border regions. Churchill understood that this justification was a mask for territorial expansion. He argued that yielding the Sudetenland would dismantle one of Central Europe's strongest bulwarks against German aggression. As British negotiators pursued a diplomatic compromise, Churchill watched with growing alarm, convinced that they were surrendering a vital strategic position in exchange for a false promise of peace. Churchill examined the military geography of Czechoslovakia with precision. The Sudeten Mountains housed formidable fortifications designed to resist invasion. These defenses represented a substantial obstacle to German forces, and without them Czechoslovakia would be strategically exposed. Churchill insisted that abandoning such strong positions made no sense from a military standpoint. He warned that once the fortifications fell into German hands, Hitler would possess a powerful springboard for further expansion into Central and Eastern Europe. His analysis emphasized how appeasement not only weakened allies but enhanced Germany's capacity for war. The Munich Conference, held in September 1938, epitomized the appeasement strategy Churchill so vehemently opposed. Without consulting Czechoslovakia, British and French leaders agreed to Hitler's demands, believing that satisfying territorial claims would secure peace. Churchill listened to Chamberlain's optimistic speeches with disbelief. He argued that the agreement represented not a triumph of diplomacy but a collapse of resolve. For him, Munich was proof that Europe had failed to grasp the nature of the threat, mistaking Hitler's appetite for a finite set of concessions rather than an unending hunger for dominance. Upon learning of the conference's outcome, Churchill described the decision as a defeat disguised as compromise. He pointed out that Hitler had achieved a major strategic victory without firing a shot. The absorption of the Sudetenland granted Germany access to Czechoslovakia's arms industry, natural resources, and defensive positions. Churchill warned that Hitler would interpret this victory as confirmation that he could secure further gains through intimidation and diplomatic theatrics. Munich, in his view, was not the preservation of peace but the prelude to a greater conflict made more dangerous by Europe's surrender. Churchill's frustration intensified as he observed how quickly Germany dismantled Czechoslovakia's institutions. Within months, the rest of the country fell to German occupation, revealing the emptiness of Hitler's promise that the Sudetenland was his last territorial demand. Churchill highlighted this betrayal as proof that no agreement with Hitler could be trusted. His speeches underscored the irrationality of negotiating with a leader whose strategy depended on deception and coercion. The human toll of Munich weighed heavily on Churchill's mind. Refugees poured out of annexed territories, bringing stories of persecution, expropriation, and fear. The collapse of Czechoslovakia's democracy served as a stark reminder of what awaited any state that fell under Nazi rule. Churchill viewed these events not as isolated tragedies but as manifestations of a larger ideological war already underway, a war fought through annexations, propaganda, and the systematic dismantling of sovereign nations. Churchill argued that Munich fundamentally altered the balance of power. Germany now controlled a vast arsenal of Czech tanks and aircraft, strengthening its military capabilities beyond what Britain had anticipated. Meanwhile, Britain's rearmament remained incomplete, and its alliances weakened. He warned that Hitler's dominance in Central Europe created a strategic position from which he could strike in multiple directions. Churchill believed that Europe had traded time for weakness, giving Germany the advantage in the inevitable conflict to come. Despite the despair Churchill felt at Munich, he also sensed that public opinion was beginning to shift. Ordinary citizens, previously comforted by promises of peace, began to recognize the pattern of German expansion. Churchill's own credibility grew as events proved his predictions accurate. Though still out of power, he continued to press for rapid rearmament and a firm stand against Hitler's next move. He believed that Britain still had time, barely, to prepare. But he also understood that the window was closing, and that each concession made the cost of resistance more severe. The aftermath of Munich forced Britain to confront the failure of appeasement. Churchill noted that public confidence, once buoyed by Chamberlain's promise of peace for our time, had begun to erode as Hitler broke commitments with impunity. The occupation of Prague in March 1939 shattered the last illusions that Hitler was merely reclaiming German-speaking territories. Churchill argued that this act exposed the full ambition of Nazi policy, the destruction of independent states and the creation of a continental empire. He emphasized that Hitler's expansion was not opportunistic but deliberate, guided by ideological conviction and strategic calculation. For Churchill, the annexation of Czechoslovakia represented a moral and strategic catastrophe. It demonstrated that Hitler's assurances were worthless, and that negotiations served only to delay confrontation while strengthening Germany's position. He pointed out that the destruction of Prague eliminated a major democratic state and deprived Europe of a potential ally. Moreover, it granted Germany control over valuable industries and resources. Churchill stressed that such gains enhanced the Reich's capacity for sustained conflict, making future resistance far more difficult. The British government, now alarmed, began reconsidering its policies. Churchill welcomed this shift but criticized the delay that allowed Germany to gain overwhelming advantages. He warned that Britain's rearmament, though expanding, remained insufficient to counter the rapidly rising threat. His speeches drew attention to the Luftwaffe's size, the Wehrmacht's mobility, and the acceleration of German industrial output. Churchill emphasized that time was no longer a currency Britain possessed in abundance. Every moment of hesitation further strengthened Hitler's hand. Churchill also analyzed the strategic implications of Germany's encroachment into Eastern Europe. The dismantling of Czechoslovakia opened pathways to Poland, Romania, and the Balkans, regions rich in oil, minerals, and agricultural resources essential for sustaining a war economy. He argued that Hitler's conquests were not random but components of a resource-driven strategy aimed at securing the materials necessary for long-term military campaigns. Churchill's understanding of logistical requirements allowed him to predict future targets with unsettling accuracy. The shift in British foreign policy became evident when the government offered guarantees to Poland, pledging support if it were attacked. Churchill viewed this as a necessary step, though he recognized that Britain was committing itself to a war for which it was still ill-prepared. He stressed that the guarantee would only be credible if backed by rapid rearmament and diplomatic coordination. Churchill argued that Britain needed alliances with France, the Soviet Union, and smaller powers to counter Germany's growing influence. He believed that collective strength, not isolated commitments, was essential for resisting Nazi expansion. Churchill's warnings extended beyond military and diplomatic concerns to the ideological nature of the Nazi regime. He insisted that Hitler's ambitions were inseparable from his racial doctrines and authoritarian vision. This ideology, Churchill argued, rendered peaceful coexistence impossible. A regime committed to conquest and oppression could never be satisfied with limited gains. He stressed that recognizing the ideological dimension of the threat was crucial for understanding why appeasement had failed and why further concessions would only hasten disaster. At home, Churchill observed a gradual shift in public sentiment. The British people, once desperate to avoid war, began to acknowledge the danger posed by Hitler's regime. Newspapers reported on German atrocities, militarization, and political repression, reinforcing Churchill's message that the threat was real and growing. He sensed that the country was awakening from its long sleep, though not quickly enough to prevent further aggression. Churchill continued to urge unity, preparedness, and moral resolve, believing that resistance was both a duty and a necessity. By mid-1939, Churchill knew that Europe was approaching a breaking point. He warned that Hitler's next move, an attack on Poland, would ignite a conflict that could engulf the continent. He believed that Britain had no choice but to honor its commitments and stand against German aggression. Though still outside the government, Churchill's influence grew as his predictions repeatedly proved accurate. He understood that the time for warnings was ending, and the time for action was rapidly approaching. Europe, he feared, was on the brink of a war that would dwarf the horrors of the last. As summer 1939 unfolded, Churchill intensified his appeals for preparedness. He sensed that Hitler was moving steadily toward a confrontation designed to test Britain's will and the credibility of its Polish guarantee. Churchill observed the German press, diplomatic maneuvers, and military deployments with forensic precision. He noted increases in troop concentrations near the Polish border, the escalation of propaganda accusing Poland of mistreating ethnic Germans, and the intensification of diplomatic pressure. To Churchill, these were unmistakable signals of an impending invasion, not mere posturing. He warned that Britain must prepare for the likelihood that Hitler intended to strike quickly, using blitzkrieg tactics refined during earlier operations. Churchill also focused on the economic and logistical preparations underway in Germany. Intelligence reports revealed accelerated stockpiling of fuel, rubber, and metals, resources essential for a prolonged conflict. He understood that such stockpiling signaled long-term planning rather than short-term intimidation. Hitler's efforts to secure oil supplies from Romania further reinforced Churchill's belief that Germany was preparing for a continental war. He argued that Britain needed to respond by securing its own strategic materials and strengthening naval defenses to impose a blockade if necessary. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939 confirmed Churchill's worst fears. He recognized that Hitler's non-aggression agreement with the Soviet Union freed Germany to attack Poland without fear of a two-front war. Churchill interpreted the pact as a cynical maneuver enabling territorial division and ideological contradiction in pursuit of mutual gain. He warned that this agreement was not a surprise but the logical outcome of Hitler's strategy, neutralizing threats before striking. Churchill insisted that Britain must stand firm, warning that failing to oppose Hitler now would lead to uncontrollable expansion later. Churchill analyzed the pact's implications beyond military strategy. He pointed out that Hitler's willingness to collaborate with Stalin, despite deep ideological hostility, revealed the dictator's pragmatic ruthlessness. This willingness to sacrifice ideological consistency in favor of strategic advantage confirmed that Hitler viewed diplomacy solely as a tool for manipulation. Churchill argued that trusting such a leader was inherently dangerous, as agreements were dictated by convenience rather than principle or stability. This insight bolstered his calls for Britain to abandon appeasement and adopt a policy based on strength and preparedness. As tensions escalated, Churchill addressed the British public through radio broadcasts and newspaper articles. He emphasized the necessity of confronting Hitler's aggression rather than yielding further ground. His arguments combined moral clarity with strategic analysis, highlighting the consequences of abandonment. If Poland fell, Churchill warned, Germany would gain the territory, resources, and positional advantage needed to dominate Europe. He predicted that France would be threatened next and that Britain would face the conflict isolated if it failed to act decisively. Churchill's warnings found increasing resonance among military leaders who recognized the shifting balance of power. They noted the rapid expansion of Germany's armored divisions, the modernization of its air force, and the disciplined cohesion of its military strategy. Churchill highlighted these developments to argue that Britain required not only rearmament but also a redefinition of its strategic priorities. He advocated for greater production of fighter aircraft, improved radar systems, and strengthened coordination with France. His emphasis on air defense reflected his belief that the next war would be shaped by speed, mobility, and technological superiority. In his final warnings before the outbreak of war, Churchill emphasized the moral stakes of the coming conflict. He argued that Britain's decision would determine not only the fate of Europe but the survival of democratic principles. He insisted that Hitler's regime, rooted in tyranny and racial domination, represented an existential threat to the values upon which Western civilization rested. Churchill's speeches stressed that resisting such a regime was not merely a matter of strategy but of ethical obligation. The world, he warned, stood at a crossroads between submission to tyranny and the defense of liberty. By late August, Churchill perceived that the hour for diplomacy had passed. Hitler's demands had escalated beyond negotiation, and his actions left no doubt about his intentions. Churchill understood that war, though tragic, was unavoidable. He prepared himself mentally for the struggle he had long predicted, recognizing that Britain would face immense challenges in the months ahead. Yet he believed that the nation's resolve, once awakened, could rise to the occasion. As Germany prepared to unleash its forces against Poland, Churchill braced for the storm that would soon engulf Europe, and for the role he knew he must play in Britain's survival. On September 1, 1939, German forces crossed into Poland with overwhelming speed and coordination. Churchill received the news with a grim sense of vindication, recognizing in the early morning reports the realization of years of warnings. The Blitzkrieg, an unprecedented combination of armored divisions, air power, and rapid communications, overwhelmed Polish defenses within days. Churchill saw in this campaign the culmination of the military capabilities he had spent years urging Britain to take seriously. The scale and tempo of the invasion confirmed that Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond the limited wars of the past. It was an aggression fueled by ideology, relentless in its aim and modern in its execution. Churchill observed closely how Germany coordinated its assaults. Dive bombers disrupted communications, tanks bypassed strong points, and mechanized infantry exploited gaps with ruthless efficiency. He noted that this level of coordination reflected years of preparation hidden behind the facade of diplomacy. The German military machine, supported by industrial mobilization and ideological indoctrination, operated with precision. Churchill emphasized that such operational mastery made resistance far more difficult and underscored the need for Britain to adopt new strategies rather than rely on the assumptions of earlier conflicts. When Britain declared war on September 3, Churchill returned to government as First Lord of the Admiralty. The moment symbolized the convergence of his long fight against complacency with the nation's acknowledgement of reality. From the Admiralty, Churchill immediately sought to strengthen naval readiness, recognizing that control of the seas would be essential for Britain's survival. He viewed the Navy not only as a defensive force but as a strategic tool capable of restricting Germany's access to crucial resources. He believed that economic pressure and naval superiority could balance Germany's advantage on land. As Poland's defenses crumbled under the combined German and Soviet assault, Churchill warned Britain that the path ahead would be long and arduous. The rapid fall of Poland demonstrated that Europe's smaller states could not withstand Germany alone. Churchill argued that this reality made collective action and strategic coordination imperative. He stressed that Britain must not underestimate the enemy's capabilities nor rely on outdated doctrines. The world had entered a new kind of war, faster, more mechanized, and more destructive than anything previously encountered. Churchill also analyzed the political implications of the war's early stages. He understood that Germany's rapid victory would embolden Hitler and encourage further aggression. The fall of Poland provided Germany with additional manpower, resources, and strategic depth. Hitler could now turn his attention westward, preparing for campaigns against France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Churchill recognized that Britain had only a short window to rearm, reorganize, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. His speeches conveyed urgency, warning that complacency during this period would be fatal. Throughout the fall of 1939, Churchill worked tirelessly to strengthen Britain's war posture. He increased convoy protection, expanded shipbuilding, and monitored German naval movements with meticulous attention. He saw the Battle of the Atlantic as the lifeline of Britain's survival, understanding that losing control of the seas would isolate the country and undermine its war effort. Churchill's foresight in prioritizing naval strategy proved crucial as Germany's U-boats intensified their attacks. He believed that maintaining maritime dominance was not merely a tactical necessity but the foundation of Britain's ability to wage a prolonged war. Churchill's warnings about Hitler took on new meaning as more evidence of Nazi brutality emerged. Reports from Poland revealed mass executions, deportations, and the systematic destruction of communities. While the full scale of the atrocities was not yet known, Churchill recognized that the war was not merely a clash of nations but a struggle against a regime driven by racial hatred and ideological extremism. His speeches reflected this understanding, framing the conflict as a moral battle for the future of civilization itself. By the end of 1939, Churchill's position within the government grew stronger as his earlier predictions proved accurate. His strategic clarity, courage, and relentless energy made him indispensable. Yet he remained acutely aware of the challenges ahead. The fall of Poland marked only the beginning of a conflict that would reshape the world. Churchill understood that Britain faced an enemy more powerful, organized, and determined than any in its history. But he also believed that Britain's resilience, unity, and moral conviction could withstand the storm. As winter settled over Europe, Churchill prepared for the darkest phase of the war, a struggle for survival that he had foreseen long before others recognized its inevitability. The early months of 1940, known as the Phony War, brought an eerie quiet to the Western Front. While Germany consolidated its control in the East, Britain and France waited for the next move. Churchill saw in this period not an interlude of peace but a dangerous opportunity for Germany to prepare. He warned that the apparent lull masked the strategic maneuvers of a regime planning its next strike. He emphasized that complacency during this period would be catastrophic, urging the government to accelerate rearmament and fortification efforts. To Churchill, every day without action increased the disparity between Britain and Germany. Germany's invasion of Denmark and Norway in April 1940 shattered the illusion of stagnation. Churchill recognized these operations as part of a broader strategy to secure vital resources and strategic positions. Control of Norway provided Germany with access to iron ore shipments from Sweden and naval bases capable of threatening Britain's maritime routes. Churchill had argued for preemptive action in Scandinavia, recognizing the region's strategic importance. When German forces moved with precision, seizing key ports and airfields, Churchill used the failure of British policy to underscore the necessity of decisive action. The Norwegian campaign, though marked by British bravery, exposed the weaknesses of Britain's wartime leadership. Churchill participated directly in strategic decisions, but he also recognized the structural failures of coordination, intelligence, and preparedness that hindered the effort. He was candid in assessing these shortcomings, insisting that Britain must reform its command structures and adopt more modern military doctrines. The campaign revealed not only German strength but British inefficiencies, reinforcing Churchill's belief that only bold, innovative leadership could guide Britain through the coming trials. As Germany's victories mounted, Churchill warned that Hitler's strategy aimed at isolating France and Britain before attempting to destroy them. He noted that the rapid fall of neutral states demonstrated Germany's ability to combine political intimidation, propaganda, and military force in devastating fashion. Churchill argued that Hitler's ultimate goal was the domination of Western Europe, and that Britain must prepare for the possibility that France could fall. His warnings were dismissed by some as pessimistic, yet he insisted that preparing for worst-case scenarios was essential for survival. Germany's invasion of the Low Countries in May 1940 confirmed Churchill's predictions. The speed of the German advance through Belgium and the Netherlands stunned military observers. Churchill analyzed the campaign in real time, noting how German armored divisions exploited gaps in Allied defenses, supported by relentless air bombardment. The collapse of the Dutch and Belgian armies demonstrated the effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics. Churchill emphasized that these victories were not merely due to German superiority but also Allied failure to adapt to modern warfare. The encirclement of Allied forces in northern France created the crisis that would define the decade. As German forces cut off the British Expeditionary Force, Churchill recognized the magnitude of the catastrophe. He understood that saving the army was essential for Britain's survival, yet he also saw the strategic defeat taking shape. His speeches during this period sought to steel the public for grim news while inspiring courage. He acknowledged the gravity of the situation but insisted that Britain would fight on, transforming despair into determination. The evacuation at Dunkirk, though miraculous, reinforced Churchill's earlier warnings about preparedness. The loss of equipment, the collapse of France, and the retreat of British forces left the nation vulnerable. Churchill refused to portray the event as a victory, calling it a colossal military disaster, even as he praised the bravery of those who fought and the civilians who aided the evacuation. He argued that Britain must recognize the scale of the threat and prepare for a long existential struggle against a formidable enemy. By the time Churchill became Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, the warnings he had issued for nearly 2 decades had come to fruition. Europe lay in ruins, Germany stood dominant, and Britain faced the storm alone. Yet the very clarity that had isolated Churchill in the 1930s now became the foundation of his leadership. He had anticipated the nature of the threat, understood its origins and foreseen its consequences. Now he was tasked with guiding his nation through the war he had long predicted, a war born from the world's refusal to heed his warnings. The early months of 1940, known as the Phony War, brought an eerie quiet to the Western Front. While Germany consolidated its control in the East, Britain and France waited for the next move. Churchill saw in this period not an interlude of peace but a dangerous opportunity for Germany to prepare. He warned that the apparent lull masked the strategic maneuvers of a regime planning its next strike. He emphasized that complacency during this period would be catastrophic, urging the government to accelerate rearmament and fortification efforts. To Churchill, every day without action increased the disparity between Britain and Germany. Germany's invasion of Denmark and Norway in April 1940 shattered the illusion of stagnation. Churchill recognized these operations as part of a broader strategy to secure vital resources and strategic positions. Control of Norway provided Germany with access to iron ore shipments from Sweden and naval bases capable of threatening Britain's maritime routes. Churchill had argued for preemptive action in Scandinavia, recognizing the region's strategic importance. When German forces moved with precision, seizing key ports and airfields, Churchill used the failure of British policy to underscore the necessity of decisive action. The Norwegian campaign, though marked by British bravery, exposed the weaknesses of Britain's wartime leadership. Churchill participated directly in strategic decisions, but he also recognized the structural failures of coordination, intelligence and preparedness that hindered the effort. He was candid in assessing these shortcomings, insisting that Britain must reform its command structures and adopt more modern military doctrines. The campaign revealed not only German strength but British inefficiencies, reinforcing Churchill's belief that only bold, innovative leadership could guide Britain through the coming trials. As Germany's victories mounted, Churchill warned that Hitler's strategy aimed at isolating France and Britain before attempting to destroy them. He noted that the rapid fall of neutral states demonstrated Germany's ability to combine political intimidation, propaganda, and military force in devastating fashion. Churchill argued that Hitler's ultimate goal was the domination of Western Europe, and that Britain must prepare for the possibility that France could fall. His warnings were dismissed by some as pessimistic, yet he insisted that preparing for worst-case scenarios was essential for survival. Germany's invasion of the Low Countries in May 1940 confirmed Churchill's predictions. The speed of the German advance through Belgium and the Netherlands stunned military observers. Churchill analyzed the campaign in real time, noting how German armored divisions exploited gaps in Allied defenses, supported by relentless air bombardment. The collapse of the Dutch and Belgian armies demonstrated the effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics. Churchill emphasized that these victories were not merely due to German superiority but also Allied failure to adapt to modern warfare. The encirclement of Allied forces in northern France created the crisis that would define the decade. As German forces cut off the British Expeditionary Force, Churchill recognized the magnitude of the catastrophe. He understood that saving the army was essential for Britain's survival, yet he also saw the strategic defeat taking shape. His speeches during this period sought to steel the public for grim news while inspiring courage. He acknowledged the gravity of the situation but insisted that Britain would fight on, transforming despair into determination. The evacuation at Dunkirk, though miraculous, reinforced Churchill's earlier warnings about preparedness. The loss of equipment, the collapse of France, and the retreat of British forces left the nation vulnerable. Churchill refused to portray the event as a victory, calling it a colossal military disaster, even as he praised the bravery of those who fought and the civilians who aided the evacuation. He argued that Britain must recognize the scale of the threat and prepare for a long existential struggle against a formidable enemy. By the time Churchill became Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, the warnings he had issued for nearly 2 decades had come to fruition. Europe lay in ruins, Germany stood dominant, and Britain faced the storm alone. Yet the very clarity that had isolated Churchill in the 1930s now became the foundation of his leadership. He had anticipated the nature of the threat, understood its origins and foreseen its consequences. Now he was tasked with guiding his nation through the war he had long predicted, a war born from the world's refusal to heed his warnings. After the fall of France in June 1940, Churchill faced the nightmare scenario he had long predicted. Britain stood alone against the most powerful war machine Europe had ever seen. Yet his years of warnings had prepared him for this moment. He understood that Hitler's next objective was to break British resistance through intimidation, negotiation, or invasion. Churchill believed that the Battle of Britain would determine whether the island nation could survive long enough to rebuild its strength and attract allies. He resolved that Britain must never yield, for capitulation would hand Hitler control of Western Europe and extinguish the last hope for freedom. Churchill analyzed Hitler's early strategy toward Britain with characteristic clarity. He recognized that Hitler preferred to avoid the costs of a full-scale invasion if intimidation or diplomacy could achieve the same result. Germany's overtures for peace, framed as generous offers, reflected Hitler's desire to neutralize Britain without diverting resources from his long-planned campaign in the East. Churchill saw through these overtures, understanding that any German peace would leave Britain disarmed, isolated, and vulnerable to future coercion. He insisted that accepting such terms would be equivalent to surrender. The Luftwaffe's assault on Britain in the summer of 1940 tested the nation's resilience. Churchill recognized that the air battle was not merely a tactical confrontation but a strategic struggle for survival. He monitored radar reports, fighter losses, and German bombing patterns with relentless attention. Churchill knew that if Germany achieved air superiority, an invasion across the Channel would become feasible. His speeches during this period sought to rally the nation, emphasizing the courage of the pilots and the necessity of continued resistance. He described the battle as a turning point, warning that defeat would plunge the world into darkness. Churchill's capacity for strategic foresight guided Britain's defensive preparations. He strengthened coastal defenses, bolstered anti-aircraft units, and coordinated with naval commanders to prepare for a German landing. He also recognized the importance of maintaining morale. The nightly bombings during the Blitz tested the endurance of civilians, yet Churchill walked among the ruins, visited shelters, and spoke directly with those affected. He understood that the war's outcome depended not only on military strength but on the collective spirit of the people. His presence provided a sense of unity that reinforced Britain's determination to continue. Churchill also recognized the importance of global alliances. He worked tirelessly to strengthen ties with the United States, understanding that American support would be essential for long-term victory. His analysis of Hitler's behavior shaped his appeals to Washington. He argued that a Nazi-dominated Europe would threaten global stability and eventually challenge American interests. Churchill's warnings, rooted in his long study of Hitler's intentions, helped shift American public opinion and paved the way for increased aid through Lend-Lease. Throughout 1940 and early 1941, Churchill monitored German movements with unrelenting vigilance. He recognized signs of preparations for Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's planned invasion of the Soviet Union. Churchill understood that Hitler's ideological hatred of Bolshevism made conflict inevitable. He predicted that the invasion would open a new front that could relieve pressure on Britain. His ability to anticipate Hitler's strategic decisions allowed him to prepare diplomatically for a potential alliance with the Soviet Union, despite its ideological differences with Britain. The decision to support the Soviet Union after Germany's invasion in June 1941 reflected Churchill's long-standing belief that Hitler posed a threat to all nations, regardless of their political systems. He argued that defeating Hitler required a coalition of every state willing to resist tyranny. Churchill's warnings about the dictator's ambitions now guided his efforts to forge a global alliance. He believed that only a united front could overcome the scale of the threat posed by Nazi Germany's ideological and military power. By the end of 1941, Churchill's leadership had transformed Britain from a nation on the brink of collapse into the center of a growing alliance. His early warnings about Hitler's intentions, once dismissed as alarmist, became the strategic foundation of Britain's war policy. Churchill's foresight allowed him to navigate crises, forge alliances, and inspire a nation under siege. The struggle was far from over, but Britain had endured the darkest phase of the war, and Churchill's warnings had become its guide for survival. The entry of the Soviet Union and the United States into the war transformed the conflict into a global struggle. Churchill recognized that the alliance of democratic and communist powers was unprecedented, yet he believed that defeating Hitler justified such cooperation. His earlier warnings about Nazi ideology now underscored the necessity of uniting disparate nations against a common threat. Churchill argued that Hitler's vision of continental dominance threatened all forms of governance that did not conform to Nazi ideology. His strategic thinking evolved to encompass not only Europe but the wider world. As the war expanded, Churchill focused on maintaining strategic cohesion among the Allies. He understood that Hitler sought to exploit differences between the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain. Churchill's years of studying Hitler's behavior convinced him that the dictator relied on dividing his enemies. To counter this, Churchill engaged in relentless diplomacy, ensuring that the Allied powers coordinated military operations, shared intelligence, and supported each other's fronts. His deep understanding of Nazi strategy made him acutely aware that unity was essential for ultimate victory. Churchill's analysis of Hitler's Eastern Front campaign reflected his awareness of the dictator's overconfidence. He recognized that Germany had underestimated the resilience of the Soviet Union, the severity of the Russian winter, and the logistical challenges of sustaining a long campaign. Churchill predicted that the war in the East would drain German resources and weaken its capacity to wage war elsewhere. His strategic advice to the Allies emphasized supporting Soviet defenses while preparing for a future counteroffensive in Western Europe. In planning for the eventual liberation of Europe, Churchill emphasized the importance of striking at Germany's periphery. He advocated for operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean to weaken German forces and disrupt supply lines. His strategic thinking reflected a recognition that Hitler's forces were stretched across vast territories. Churchill argued that removing Germany from North Africa, securing control of the Mediterranean, and undermining Italy's role in the Axis would create pressure on Germany from multiple directions. Churchill also continued to warn the Allies about the danger of underestimating Hitler's ability to adapt. He emphasized that even as Germany suffered setbacks, the regime retained significant military capacity and ideological resolve. Churchill's understanding of totalitarian regimes led him to argue that Germany would fight with increasing desperation as the war turned against it. He warned that Hitler's refusal to accept defeat would prolong the conflict and result in devastating destruction before final victory could be achieved. Churchill's strategic foresight extended to the war's psychological dimension. He understood that propaganda played a crucial role in sustaining morale on both sides. He worked to counter Nazi propaganda by emphasizing the righteousness of the Allied cause. Churchill believed that framing the war as a struggle for human freedom strengthened public resolve. His speeches reinforced the belief that the sacrifices made were essential for preserving civilization from tyranny. As the tide of war gradually turned, Churchill maintained caution. He warned that Germany remained dangerous even when retreating. He studied Hitler's defensive strategies, predicting that the dictator would attempt to prolong the conflict through scorched earth tactics, fortified positions, and civilian mobilization. Churchill argued that the Allies must prepare for fierce resistance and avoid assuming that German defeat would be swift or easy. By mid-1943, Churchill's warnings had become integral to Allied planning. His deep understanding of Hitler's methods shaped decisions on where and when to strike. Churchill believed that only overwhelming force, combined with strategic cunning and ideological clarity, could bring the war to an end. His years of warnings had evolved into a blueprint for victory, one rooted in the recognition that defeating Hitler required not only superior firepower but a profound understanding of the dictator's mindset, ambitions, and capacity for destruction. The Allied victories in North Africa and the Mediterranean confirmed Churchill's belief in the value of peripheral strategy. He saw the defeat of the Afrika Korps and the collapse of Italy as blows that weakened Germany's strategic position and divided its focus. Churchill emphasized that such victories not only deprived Germany of key allies and resources but also compelled Hitler to divert troops to secondary fronts. This fragmentation of German defenses validated Churchill's long-standing warnings that the war could only be won by stretching Germany beyond its logistical and operational limits. As preparations for the liberation of Western Europe began, Churchill played a crucial role in shaping the Allied approach. He recognized that Hitler anticipated an invasion but sought to mislead him about the timing and location. Churchill studied German defensive preparations along the Atlantic Wall, analyzing where Hitler expected the assault to occur. His understanding of Hitler's strategic mind informed Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception plan designed to convince Germany that the invasion would take place at Pas-de-Calais. Churchill's appreciation of Hitler's belief in conventional logic and hierarchical planning made this deception particularly effective. The success of the D-Day landings in June 1944 confirmed Churchill's belief that Hitler's strategic intuition could be manipulated through misinformation. Germany responded slowly and hesitantly, convinced by false intelligence that the Normandy landings were a diversion. Churchill noted that Hitler's obsession with expected scenarios, rather than emerging realities, made him vulnerable to Allied deception. He understood that totalitarian leadership often fosters rigidity, a flaw that could be exploited. The initial foothold in Normandy marked a turning point, demonstrating how strategic insight could overcome even entrenched defenses. As Allied forces advanced into France, Churchill monitored German reactions closely. He recognized that Hitler's refusal to allow tactical retreats or flexible responses hampered the Wehrmacht's effectiveness. Churchill had long argued that Hitler's belief in his own infallibility would eventually undermine German military operations. This prediction proved accurate as Hitler dismissed professional military advice and ordered fanatical defenses that depleted German forces without achieving strategic gains. Churchill saw these actions as evidence of a dictator losing touch with reality, hastening the collapse he had once feared would be unstoppable. The liberation of Paris and the subsequent advance across Western Europe reflected the culmination of Churchill's strategic warnings and long-term planning. He recognized that the war was entering its final phase, but he also understood that Germany remained capable of fierce resistance. Churchill predicted that Hitler would respond to defeats with increased brutality and desperation. This understanding shaped Allied strategy, emphasizing the need to maintain pressure on all fronts and avoid complacency as the lines of battle shifted in the Allies' favor. Churchill's concern shifted toward the long-term consequences of Hitler's regime. He warned that even as Germany weakened, the ideological machinery of Nazism remained intact. Churchill believed that the physical defeat of the German state must be accompanied by the destruction of its ideological foundations. He feared that if the Nazi system survived in any form, Europe could face renewed danger in the future. This insight shaped Allied policies toward denazification and post-war reconstruction, reflecting Churchill's belief that victory required not only military triumph but moral and political transformation. As the Allies approached Germany's borders, Churchill studied Hitler's behavior for signs of potential last-ditch strategies. He predicted that the dictator might attempt to sow chaos through scorched-earth tactics, the mobilization of civilians, and the launch of desperate counteroffensives. The Battle of the Bulge confirmed these fears. Hitler's final major offensive, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice remaining forces in pursuit of impossible objectives. Churchill saw this as characteristic of a leader who viewed retreat as dishonor and defeat as inconceivable. By late 1944, Churchill recognized that the end of the war was approaching, yet he remained vigilant. He believed that victory must be decisive to prevent any resurgence of the forces that had plunged the world into war. Churchill's decades of warnings, once dismissed, ignored, or resisted, had proven accurate in every detail. Now, as the endgame unfolded, he sought to ensure that the mistakes of the interwar period would not be repeated. His vision extended beyond defeating Hitler to building a world where such a threat could never arise again. As Allied forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, Churchill reflected on the long arc of events that had led to this moment. He had warned of Hitler's rise when few took the threat seriously. Now the consequences of ignoring those warnings lay in ruins across Europe. Churchill understood that the end of the war would be remembered not only for the defeat of Nazi Germany but for the devastation wrought by years of unchecked aggression. He believed that the final phase of the conflict required not only military strength but moral clarity. The crimes of the regime, increasingly revealed as Allied troops liberated camps and cities, reinforced the necessity of total victory. Churchill insisted that the Allied advance must be relentless. He recognized that Hitler, cornered and desperate, would cling to power until the last possible moment. Reports from the front confirmed that German forces continued to resist even in hopeless situations, driven by fear, indoctrination, or blind loyalty. Churchill warned that such resistance would prolong suffering and demanded that the Allies maintain pressure until Germany could no longer sustain its military operations. For Churchill, the war's conclusion would not be secured through negotiation but only through complete and undeniable defeat. As details of the Holocaust emerged, Churchill's understanding of Hitler's intentions gained a new, horrifying dimension. He had warned for years that Hitler's racial ideology was inherently violent and expansionist. Yet the systematic extermination of millions revealed a level of brutality that surpassed even his darkest expectations. Churchill recognized that Nazi Germany had committed crimes that required not only condemnation but justice. He argued that the post-war world must hold the perpetrators accountable to prevent future atrocities fueled by hate and fanaticism. Churchill's focus shifted to shaping the post-war settlement. He believed that the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles must not be repeated. Germany needed to be disarmed, Nazism eradicated, and democratic institutions fostered. Churchill warned that punishing the German people collectively would only sow resentment, creating fertile ground for future extremism. His vision emphasized reconciliation grounded in accountability. He believed that Europe's peace depended on rebuilding Germany in a way that empowered its citizens while preventing any return to militarism. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 reflected Churchill's commitment to creating a stable post-war order. He understood that cooperation with the United States and the Soviet Union was essential, though such cooperation required balancing complex political realities. Churchill recognized that Soviet expansionism posed a potential threat, yet he believed that the immediate priority was defeating Nazi Germany. His strategic vision encompassed not only the war's conclusion but the geopolitical landscape that would emerge afterward. As Hitler retreated into his bunker beneath Berlin, Churchill observed signs of the dictator's psychological collapse. Reports from inside Germany described a leader increasingly detached from reality, issuing impossible orders and fantasizing about salvation through non-existent forces. Churchill had predicted that Hitler's overconfidence would eventually give way to desperation. Now he saw that prediction unfolding. Hitler's final days, marked by delusion and destruction, epitomized the tragic consequences of unchecked tyranny. When Hitler took his own life in April 1945, Churchill noted the symbolic significance. The man whose ambitions had reshaped Europe was gone, yet the scars he left behind would endure for generations. Churchill believed that the dictator's death marked the beginning of a new era, one in which Europe could rebuild from the ashes of war. Yet he warned that the world must remain vigilant. The forces of hatred, extremism, and authoritarianism had been defeated but not eradicated. Churchill insisted that protecting freedom required constant effort and collective resolve. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Churchill's warnings had come full circle. The war he had predicted, feared, and fought had reached its conclusion. Britain, though bloodied and exhausted, stood among the victors. Churchill understood that victory belonged not only to armies but to the ideas that had guided the Allied cause. His decades-long struggle against complacency demonstrated that foresight, moral conviction, and strategic courage can confront even the darkest forces of history. In the ruins of Europe, Churchill saw not only devastation but the possibility of renewal, a world rebuilt on the hard-won lessons of resistance to tyranny. As Churchill reflected on the long struggle against Hitler, he recognized that the war had revealed fundamental truths about humanity, power, and political responsibility. His early warnings had emerged from a deep understanding of history's repeating patterns, where tyrants exploit weakness and democracies falter when disunited. Churchill believed that the central lesson of the interwar years was clear. Peace depends not only on treaties and diplomacy but on vigilance, strength, and moral clarity. The cost of ignoring this truth had been enormous, measured in cities burned, nations destroyed, and millions of lives lost. Churchill hoped that the post-war world would remember these lessons, not repeat them. Churchill's experience taught him that democracies face unique challenges in confronting threats. Their openness, debate, and desire for peace can make them slow to recognize danger. Hitler had exploited these qualities, advancing while Europe hesitated. Churchill argued that effective leadership must balance the pursuit of peace with preparedness for conflict. He believed that leaders must possess the courage to speak uncomfortable truths and resist the temptation of easy compromises. His years in political exile, warning a reluctant nation, illustrated how difficult, but essential, this role can be. The war had also demonstrated the power of ideology. Churchill understood that Hitler's rise was not merely the product of economic hardship or political turmoil but of a poisonous vision that appealed to resentment and fanaticism. He emphasized that combating such ideologies required more than military force. It demanded the defense of principles, liberty, justice, and human dignity. Churchill believed that societies must remain vigilant against extremism in all forms, for the seeds of tyranny often grow unnoticed until they bloom into violence. Churchill's leadership during the war became the embodiment of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet he knew that personal determination alone could not have saved Britain. The nation's survival depended on collective courage, the bravery of pilots defending the skies, the endurance of civilians under bombardment, the resolve of soldiers fighting across continents, and the strength of allies who joined the cause. Churchill viewed this unity as a testament to the human spirit's capacity to rise above fear. He hoped that future generations would draw inspiration from this example. In the post-war world, Churchill warned that new dangers would arise. Though Nazi Germany had been defeated, the ideological conflicts of the 20th century were far from resolved. He recognized the growing tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies, predicting that the next struggle would center on political and ideological dominance rather than territorial conquest. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech reflected his understanding that vigilance must continue even in peacetime. The same clarity that enabled him to foresee Hitler's threat now guided his warnings about the emerging Cold War. Despite the burdens of leadership, Churchill never wavered in his belief in the necessity of confronting evil. He argued that peace founded on compromise with tyranny is fragile and doomed to collapse. His experiences taught him that delaying resistance only strengthens aggressors. Churchill believed that courage, moral, political, and military, must form the foundation of international relations. He hoped that nations would remember how close the world came to losing everything and would act to prevent such a crisis from ever recurring. Churchill's role in the war became inseparable from his warnings about Hitler. His foresight, once dismissed, became prophetic in retrospect. Yet Churchill himself remained humble about his predictions, attributing them to a combination of historical study and instinct. He believed that understanding the patterns of human ambition was essential for interpreting global events. His warnings were not the product of pessimism but of realism, a recognition that ignoring danger invites disaster. As he looked back on the long years of struggle, Churchill took solace in the fact that Britain had stood firm when it mattered most. The nation's refusal to yield, despite overwhelming odds, had changed the course of history. Churchill hoped that the world would remember not only the victories but the warnings that made them possible. His message echoed through the post-war years, that freedom survives only when defended, that tyranny thrives on complacency, and that the price of peace is eternal vigilance. In this final reflection, Churchill saw his life's work not as a series of battles won but as a legacy of lessons, warnings for all who would face the dangers of future ages.